My name is Daniel Edwards. I'm on the Adult Ministry Committee, and I'm here to welcome you to the Summer Adult Forum. Are there any announcements that we need to cover ahead of time? Okay. Before we start, I want to let you know that next week our speaker is AJ Northrup to talk about Idlewild's relationship with the 1G Hall Presbyterian Church in Cardenas, Cuba. Let's pray. Today's prayer is from Psalm 72. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May the mountains yield prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the needy and crush the oppressor. May he be like rain that falls on the mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In his days may righteousness flourish and peace abound until the moon is no more. Amen. Our speaker today is Dr. Raissa Rande. She's an assistant professor of religious studies at Rhodes College. She teaches classes on Islam, the Quran, and comparative ethics, and her topic today is the politics of human nature. Please welcome Dr. Rande.
Yeah, everybody. Go ahead. All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, everybody. Okay, great. I have this weird microphone thing, so I also apologize if I seem a bit like, when I agreed to this, I was a lot less pregnant, and now I'm like very pregnant, and I'm like, why did I agree to this? So just if I like look a bit off, then just blame it on my child. Thank you. All right, it's a pleasure, as I said, to be with you all this morning. I have about 40 minutes of presentation prepared on my forthcoming book, which is coming out with Cambridge University Press next year, and after which, like 40 minutes or so, we should have some time for questions. I am going to start us off with a little interactive exercise. Well, I made my students mostly do it, but at the end of last semester, I asked my students at Rhodes in my ethics and scripture class, I say human nature, you say. And then they all typed into their computers, and those are the things. Maybe let me go this way.
Now, let me do
Those
one
are the
thing
things
here.
that
I'm trying to get something.
Came up with. What do you notice? Lord of the Flies, yeah.
I don't know what's the matter with this thing.
What else? Weird. Okay. Are you gonna press this? Okay. Can they agree on anything? Very little. So if anybody said something twice, it gets bigger. So the only thing that got said twice is instincts, really, which is interesting.
Okay, give me 1 second.
I also really like that somebody said unethical and somebody said ethical.
I got a lecture.
Which is pretty true of what we'll see in a second. Okay, it's really just meant to show that, like any good concept, especially any kind of ethical concept, human nature is thick, as we say in the study of ethics, and has a complex history. It is deeply influenced by our own context and not stable, hence all these different disagreements, right? People talk about their childhood, conditioning, things that are instinct, animal, genetics, literally anything. And some of them are distinctly modern, right? Genetics, Lord of the Flies are not things that would be interesting to people a few hundred years ago. This insight, the kind of thickness and instability and contextual nature of a concept such as human nature, which seems so important and clear to us today, is an important segue into talking about my book, The Politics of Human Nature. In the book, I talk about a fundamental concept in Islamic thought called fitra, or the created human nature. I'll talk about this more in a second. And I argue that this concept of human nature in Islam is a lot more complex than people within or without the academic study of Islam make it seem. I will show that created human nature is, among other things, a mostly political concept during an important juncture in Islamic history, the age of classical philosophy. I'll talk about this more in a second too. Human nature is not one thing for the Islamic tradition or does one type of work. It has been interpreted in a variety of ways by different Islamic discourses. What we learn specifically from the philosophers' engagement with human nature is that they used what is thought of as a purely Quranic concept, a religious concept, and they were interpreted to be about the intellect, broadly speaking. For them, the concept is primarily of political recognition, importance. The recognition that these Islamic philosophers used created human nature, this Quranic idea, and did so in a variety of ways, has implications for how we think today about the pre-modern Islamic tradition. meaning it is not monolithic. A lot of people do a lot of things with different sources. It's kind of similar to saying like Kant read his Bible really well. That's like a big insight in the study of Islam to make that. And I've still in the study of Kant, really. Okay, now in turn, this complexity, this boundary defying insight about Islamic history needs to be reflected, I argue, in the book in the ways we approach, study, and teach the pre-modern Islamic intellectual tradition. If things were a lot more messy in the pre-modern era, if different kinds of people use different resources, then we need to talk about Islam in a way that's more than the Quran says. I will talk about those kind of larger issues at the end of my talk. All right, to give you a little sense of the things that we'll learn about today and the thinkers and the texts, I'll cover the following. I'll introduce you to the concept of created human nature in the pre-modern Islamic context, including the often cited scriptural origins of the concept from the Quran and the Hadith. And then I'll give you a quick overview of how I think about key concepts such as ethics and politics in the book. And then I cede the stage for the majority of the talk to the Islamic philosophers, people that usually general audiences are not as familiar with. And then in the end, I'll consider what all of this means and for the study of religion and why even my students might be interested in this issue. Now, let's start with created human nature. As I mentioned, if we want to think about human nature more broadly in the Islamic context, we're mostly talking about this concept of created human nature, or what in the Quran is called fitra. I have the word up there. Promise it's the only Arabic word you'll be encountering during this talk. Now, there are some other concepts used in parallel. We might see some come up in the talk. I'll not be talking about them though. We're going to focus on fitra. This concept stems from the Arabic root fatara. Fatara means generally to create something or to split it open. So the idea is similar to what you see in Genesis, right? The beginning, God kind of cracks things open, separates things. That's how creation works. Creation is a kind of a dividing things from each other. Heaven and earth, water from dry land. So that's similarly here reflected in the Arabic. According to the Arabic lexicographers, the root primarily describes God as a creator of humanity. It is generally agreed that fitra in Islamic thought comes from the scriptural sources of Islam, the Quran and the Hadith, and describes human nature as it is marked by God's particular act of creation, which means for Islam, by a shared religious foundation and awareness of God. So we'll see this in a second here in the Quran. The two sources that give this idea of fitra to Islamic thought are the Quran and the Hadith. So God's word to Muhammad, the Quran and the Hadith, which are words of the early followers of Muhammad about Muhammad. In the Quran, this idea of created human nature shows up exactly once. And so we read there, so as a person of pure faith, stand firm and true in your devotion to the religion. This is the fitra, the nature God instilled in mankind. There is no altering God's creation, and this is the right religion, though most people do not realize it. That's the only time this idea of a created human nature actually shows up in the Quran. And then pretty early on, people were asking Muhammad about it. They were like, well, what is this fitra thing? So we have a hadith saying that Muslims believe Muhammad himself said about this verse. And so the Prophet said, nobody is born except upon the fitra. So every human being is created with this nature that God gave them. Then their parents make him a Jew or a Christian or a Zoroastrian. Now, we could speculate, this is a very complex hadith, has a lot to say about inter-religious dialogue, but we're not here to speculate about that. And as a separate book, the general helpful thing about Islamic thought is that you have a long tradition of scriptural commentators. So ranging almost back to the 7th century. A very popular commentary from the 12th century, though, people generally look to, is by this fellow called Al-Tabarsi, and he gives a good illustration of what Muslims think this fitra is. It says this created human nature is the deen, or the religion, and the Islam and the oneness that God created humanity upon and for and with, meaning for its sake and adherence to it. Yeah, Islamic commentaries are great fun to read. So what that means, you get about a few hundred centuries of people thinking about this claim, is generally that people now agree this created human nature in Islam means for the majority of Muslim people that fitra means Islam, meaning that most human beings, or everyone really, is created to start their life as a Muslim. Now, this is something, if you have the Imam visiting, we might talk more about, but the idea is that everybody's created on sort of proto-Islam, and then depending on how you grow up, your parents take you in a different direction. So you grow up with Jewish parents, then you become a Jew. You grow up with Christian parents, you become a Christian. But at the heart of humanity, according to the Quranic view, is that everybody's created to be a Muslim. What you mean by that now is up to debate. Maybe you can be a Muslim by being a Christian. It gets complicated. But the idea is that everybody has some sort of awareness of God in them by nature. So that's generally the image you get if you turn to the literature on fitra. If you're like, oh, I'm interested in human nature and Islam, people will be like, yeah, the specific thing that Islam thinks about human nature is that everybody starts their life as a Muslim. So human nature in Islam is leveling. It includes everybody, right? Whether you're Jew or Christian or Muslim or Zoroastrian. Let's not talk about atheists. They don't come off so well in this. But different topic. So leveling. It's very religiously oriented. What marks humanity at the bottom is not we all have a certain form, or we all like to preserve ourselves in certain ways, right? Like Thomas Aquinas would say, what's at the bottom of humanity? It's first of all an instinct for self-preservation, for procreation, and for rational thought. This is different. At the bottom of humanity is some sort of awareness of God, whatever it means, whatever it includes. So it's leveling, it's religiously oriented, and it's a concept that primarily takes its cues from the theological and particularly scriptural interpreters of Islam, right? So if you are interested in human nature and Islam, again, the source that you should be looking to is some sort of Quranic idea. Now, what most people do not know, that's what I'm here, what my book is about, is two things. Other people, in my case, the philosophers, actually used this concept. And they did so primarily to talk about intellectual difference and its impact on politics and ethics, asking questions about the needs and ends and shapes of human life. So I'm here to say today that despite the fact most people think human nature and Islam is all about being religious, there's lots of other Islamic thinkers that have actually used this concept to say a lot of different things about what's at the bottom of humanity. Before we get into the weeds of my philosophical engagement, I wanted to provide you an overview of the building block, so to speak, of my work, my interlocutors, and my assumptions. You don't need to know a lot about these people, but I kind of wanted to introduce them so you know who we're dealing with. So I am primarily an expert on the Islamic philosophical tradition. What does that mean? Well, there is a period in Islam and Islamic history that thinkers are primarily reading Greek philosophy in translation. These people are called the falasifa, which is just an Arabic way of saying philosophers. And their main job is to try and understand the Greek tradition. Before, Christians were reading Plato and Aristotle. The Syriacs were reading it, and then the people who were writing in Arabic, so the Arabic philosophers. So there's this so-called translation movement. So people, whenever we think of like, oh, the great classics and how they gave us our civilization, there's like a bunch of people in between. Like Thomas Aquinas wasn't just reading Plato and Aristotle. In fact, he had to wait on translations from the Greek. And they were mostly made from these Arabic thinkers. So these are the people we're engaging with, the Arabic philosophers. I am specifically looking at 4 figures. A fellow called Al-Farabi, dies in the 10th century. And then his readers, so he's in the East, in the Abbasid of Iraq, think very East. And then his thought gets picked up by the Western Islamic thinkers in Al-Andalus, what's now Spain, by a bunch of thinkers, Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Tufail, and Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd might be familiar to you as Averroes, but yeah, his name is Ibn Rushd. In the Latin, people sometimes call him Averroes. Each of them has a very different corpus, so they're all doing different projects. We have commentaries on Plato and Aristotle from them, as well as their own political works. So Al-Farabi in particular is very famous for writing his own political kind of versions of the Republic, things like that. That's what you wrote, you know, like instead of like writing your own autobiography these days as a celebrity, you just wrote your own vision of like, what's a cool city. So that's what Al-Farabi did. Mystical works from Ibn Bajjah, a really famous philosophical tale, the first Robinsonade from this guy called Ibn Tufail. And then probably one of the most complex corpora in all of intellectual history, Ibn Rushd. He literally covers anything anybody ever heard of at the time, from commentaries on the Greek tradition to law, philosophy, spirituality, the Quran. He really knew a lot of things. So we have a bunch of very different thinkers, but I engage with all of them on this question of human nature. All right, and as I said, we're roughly in the Western Islamic land, Spain, and a little bit in the East with Al-Farabi, who starts in this translation movement, which starts in Iraq, and somewhere between the 10th and the 12th century, roughly. Okay, so these are our interlocutors who we'll be hearing from on this question of like, what's human nature? But there's two other things I wanted to quickly say. So I talk about the politics and the ethics of human nature. And when I say politics, I don't mean politics in a kind of contemporary sense, but more in the classical expansive sense. So possibilities of power, relations among people, not just what is government, how high should taxes be, but also meta questions such as, do we need society? Why are we in society? How are societies organized? Is it natural for humans to be social? Those are all questions that in the pre-modern tradition are thought of as political. So in that conception, this classical conception of politics, which we get from Aristotle, ethics is included in politics. Because ethics is the search for the good life within the question of the larger question of like, why do we even live together at all, right? If you start with like a big political question, do we need to live in society? The kind of sub-question of that is, what does a good life look like once we live in society? So the ethics and the politics, well, the ethics is included in the politics. And so questions that fall under this kind of larger ethical conception is, what is the human being? Also, what are the ends and virtues of the human being? And how do we become virtuous? So we'll probably think of them as the very large questions today. Here I have examples. What's in our nature? What's the best society? Who can rule? Who's a good ruler? They're all included in this. Okay. As I said, today's goal is to show you that rather than only equalizing in theological, created human nature in Islamic thought can be intellectual and used to discuss human difference, particularly in the context of politics and ethics. So what is created human nature for the philosophers? I'm going to walk us through a few answers that some of the thinkers that I introduced have, just to show you some of the variety and kind of particular focus that the philosophers bring. Al-Farabi was our first thinker historically and first person really in the Islamic tradition to engage with Greek philosophy. Thinks that this created human nature, this thing that God gives us, is the source of what he thinks of as the first principles, an Aristotelian concept. It actually seems likely that he introduced the following philosophical tradition in Arabic to the idea that human nature is the source of the first principles. So he writes, as for the intellect, which Aristotle mentions in the book of Demonstration, by it he means that faculty of the soul by which a person achieves certainty with respect to the universal true necessary premises. A person does not arrive at these premises by considering a syllogism or discursive thought, but rather by the fitra, by their human nature. So here we see really what's descriptive of the whole tradition. He merges Aristotelian thought with the Quran. It says, oh, as Aristotelians, we're interested in certainty, right? The principles of logic, the things we know, we don't have to kind of consider, we just know deep in our hearts. And the source of that is not any kind of knowledge that we acquire, but it comes from this created human nature. Or in short, fitra is the human nature is the source of the first principles, which are the things that are at the bottom of demonstration. The example Farabi always gives is the whole is bigger than its parts, which to us is kind of like, okay. But that's like the most basic principle of knowledge, right? Like the whole is bigger than its constituent parts. The parts can't be bigger than the entire thing. So these kind of principles are the building blocks of our mind. But as we'll see for Farabi, human nature is not limited to this kind of logical question. He actually applies it to virtue theory, music theory, and all of those. Human nature gives us the important essential principles to make distinctions in these realms. Now, this idea that Farabi introduces to the Islamic tradition on making essential distinctions or choices connects all the philosophers, but we'll see now that they actually take this idea and then care about very different things. So Ibn Bajjah, Farabi's first reader in the Islamic West, takes some of this idea up, but then develops it. So he says, the person who lacks by their fitra, by their nature, the connection with the necessary principles is unable to teach logic. Okay, that makes sense. Farabi said, in order to access logic, you need to have a functioning human nature. But then he takes things further. He actually focuses on the question of like, okay, if it's all about, logic and the intellect, where does it come from? So he's actually the one who specifically says what Farabi wouldn't say, and says that it comes from God, whatever he thinks God is. Whoever obeys God and does what he pleases him will be rewarded with this intellect, and he will make before him the light by which they will be guided. Whoever disobeys him and does what displeases him will remain shrouded in the shadows of ignorance. We might be a bit close to a lot of these ideas. They are foreign to you maybe, but the important thing here is rather than talk about religion, talk about awareness of God, what he talks about here is essentially if you're smart, that comes from God, right? Like he's taken the whole tradition in a different direction. The same we see with Ibn Tufayl. I'm not going to focus on that for a second. We're going to jump to our final thinker, Ibn Rushd, because he recasts things. He's at the end of this tradition of engaging with Al-Farabi, and he also thinks about fitra intellectually. Kind of everybody has to after Al-Farabi said that, but he's particularly interested in different knowledge discourses. So he takes this idea and applies it again to something he's interested in, which is not really logic. So he agrees that human nature is at the heart, not theological, but intellectual. So he says, concerning the things that are known only by demonstration, due to their being hidden, God has been gracious to servants for whom there's no path by means of demonstration, either due to their nature, their habits, or their lack of facilities for education, by coining for them likenesses as similarities and calling them to ascend by the means of those likenesses. So he's saying, to be smart, you need a good nature, but not everybody has it. All right. He has a clear connection to Farabi. It's through your nature that you can participate in logic. And he also talks about, this connection to God and so on. But he introduces this thing that he's particularly interested in, and we'll see come up in a second in a different context, and that's education. He says, all right, so if Farabi is right, and it's really like a natural thing to be smart and participate in logic, is that enough? And so he introduces this idea of the knowledgeable teacher. And we'll come back to that because it has large political implications. All right, where does this leave us? What did I want you to get from this? Mostly, first of all, so you can interpret human nature as purely intellectual in the Islamic tradition rather than just focus on awareness of God. For the philosopher, human nature is, or being created, is primarily about your access to demonstrative knowledge and intellectual ability. And as the three thinkers we just briefly looked at show, you can get both overlapping and very distinct takes on this intellectual idea of human nature. Meaning for Al-Farabi, fitra is the source of the first principles of logic, but he also applies it to intellectual pursuits he's interested in, such as music. For Ibn Bajjah, logic matters, but he's more interested in the origins of human nature as a divine gift. For Ibn Rushd, logic is interesting, but he's particularly concerned with education. So each of them believes human nature to be intellectual, but each of them also cares about something slightly different, though overlapping. Now, you might have already noticed, but related to this intellectual interpretation of human nature is a varying one. It makes sense, right? You can kind of claim, oh, everybody is aware of God in some way. That's a nice base claim. You could say everybody's intellectual in some way, but even in the 9th century, people were aware that some people are smarter than others. In fact, they were very aware of that. They love talking about it all the time. So you kind of can make that claim, but then you immediately have to talk about the fact that like the vast majority of people don't care about logic, which probably is still true today. But so it very quickly introduces this idea of variability, which means that this is something people aren't aware of, but rather than talk about this leveling idea, right, everything is the same, human nature for the philosophers is actually their cue to talk about human difference. This is very counterintuitive for us today. I think when we think about human nature and human rights, we think about things we want to give to everybody, right? We're like, well, that's a human rights issue. And then we mean that kind of applies to everybody. Women's rights are human rights. That's also a good thing. But I'm not questioning any of those things, please. But the logic is it applies to everybody. Opposite is true for the philosophers. They're like, this is an issue of human nature. It applies to some of us. So they really wanted to talk about human difference. They are not interested actually in talking about human commonalities. In fact, reading like 40 different treatises over the last, I don't know, 6 years I spent on this book, I don't think, maybe there's like a page or two about what humans share. And it's very thin. So for example, in the case of Al-Farabi, he loves talking about how we're all really different. So he says, not every human being is created, yuftar, so it's the same root as this human nature concept, fitra, so is created by God, prepared to receive the first intelligibles, because individuals by their nature are made with varied faculties in divergent preparations. All right. This explains the, at this point, very familiar pairing of human nature, in fact, with adjectives such as perfect, healthy, excellent, and deficient, or not healthy. So the philosophers love talking about this person has a great human nature. This person has a perfect human nature. And then there's the most people actually are very deficient in their human nature. Again, to us, very strange. We think of it as something there's something at the bottom here. Now, of course, the idea that humans differ, some are really good at being human and some are less good at being human, is extremely politically relevant, because you probably don't want to give a lot of power to the people you think are not good at being human. So, but we'll see versions of this varying human nature again. So our friend Ibn Bajjah, who loves talking about mysticism, takes things actually a bit further. He's kind of a pessimist. But anyway, so he says, so we find that whoever is created to be a carpenter, they are not created to be something other than that, so that they're only disposed to serving others, and their perfection is to serve others, and this is the most desirable existence. And the person of perfect nature, they are the one created to be just for themselves. And so it is clear that the exceptional nature is the nature by which one attains theoretical knowledge. And you have the exceptional nature, and you should take care that you do not take it down to the level of deficiency. So two things we see here. A version of what people might be familiar with is Aristotle talks about people naturally born to serve, or what some people talk as natural slavery. Of course, a very problematic idea that has a long history in Western thought afterwards, and we see it reflected here. Some people are born to be leaders, and some people are born to not be leaders. If you're ever familiar with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, you get the idea there reflected. People are alphas, some people are gammas. The gammas clean the street. The alphas are the leaders. That's a Platonic idea. Some people are kings and some people are not, and that's it. And so we see this here. The interesting thing is for Ibn Bajjah, again, importance talking about politics, because he's really afraid that if you are an alpha and you have the good nature, you shouldn't be associating with the people with the bad nature, right? Don't take it down to the level of deficiency. We're going to see that more of that in a second. So it influences where you should live, who you should interact with. Now, while Ibn Bajjah and Al-Farabi really zoom in on the difference, the only person who really ever, as I said, has anything today to say about kind of how maybe we could mitigate these differences and is there something we all share as humans, is actually this guy Ibn Rushd, who's interested in education. Makes sense, right? If you're interested in education, you kind of believe at some point that education has some sort of influence, right? Like it will help people. So he actually kind of ponders a little bit more the idea of like, well, how can we deal with this human difference? And he's particularly concerned in the legal context. He talks about the different ways God and lawgivers try to influence people. So he talks about the fact that the reason that there is an apparent and an inner sense set down in Revelation is the difference in people's natures and the variance in their capacities. So he says, you know, the reason that we have all these different measures, what we would think of as educational or kind of policing measures, is that we have this human difference. But he says there is also something, since we're all able to live together, that is shared. So he actually returns, which is why Ibn Rushd is so interesting, to some of the Quranic ideas. And he says there is some sort of shared human path by which God called the people to a knowledge of his existence, and alerted them about it by the way of awareness or consciousness he placed in their nature. So he's the last one in this line of people that I look at, and he kind of returns to some of these Quranic ideas, and he's like, yeah, Al-Farabi's right, everybody's differently smart, but maybe education can make a difference. We do all live together, so maybe there is something everybody shares, and that's religious. So he's very interesting in that context of talking about variance. Now, where does that leave us? So I wanted to show human nature is intellectual. Second, it is for those thinkers varying. It is mostly used to talk about difference. It discusses this human nature concept and grounds suitability to different discourses and different professions, right? If people have different intellectual abilities, they have different jobs, and they might have different ways in which they process knowledge. Interestingly, just on the linguistic level, actually, and I mentioned this in the talk, but human nature is often used in the plural and paired with adjectives of difference, such as excellent, strong, and healthy, which again is something that's kind of very strange to us. At the same time, we also see some sort of emergence of a shared foundation, but it is in the context of education. Now, I've talked a lot about politics. I also want to show you how politics actually shows up as kind of the crown of this whole discourse. Both in genre and in some of the concerns that the thinkers bring up, it's very clear to me that the intellectual and varying fitra, or human nature, is mostly an instrument to talk about politics. It impacts how we think about human sociality and power relations if we think humans are intellectual primarily and different in their intellectual abilities. As I mentioned, these philosophers related human nature to a whole host of issues: music theory, virtue, mysticism. But one concern that has not been recognized in scholarship and people hardly talk about is the way in which human nature is used as the foundation to political imaginations. As we'll see in a second, the reason humans are in society is because of their human nature. Because we cannot perfect ourselves, because humans are so different in their ability, we need to come together in society to fulfill the needs that we might ourselves not can fulfill. So to have others help us fulfill the needs we can't fulfill ourselves. That's the basic idea. Again, it's a very kind of Platonic idea, but the Arabic philosophers have a lot to say filling out those details. So Al-Farabi, who's the first, again, who reads the Greek thinkers, gives us the classical theory. He makes it very clear that it's because our natures are different in excellence that we need others. Verily, it is the nature of every person or fitra to join another human being or other people in their necessary striving. For this reason, the human being is called the social and political animal. So unlike other creatures or species, we are different. We can't do all the things ourselves. Nobody is kind of an island, essentially. And so we need to come together. Now, given that humans need to come together, the goal of politics then is to lead people to their happiness based on their human nature, meaning not everybody, again, can fulfill their own happiness in society because they are limited in their abilities. As you can already see from this, Al-Farabi is what we think of as an elitist. In fact, most of the thinkers that we're encountering here, which is pretty common in the pre-modern period. But his ideal society is hierarchically organized by tiers of human nature. So he says specifically, talking about the city, the limbs and organs of the body are different in their nature or their fitar, and faculties are unequal in excellence, being among them one ruling organ, namely the heart. The same holds good in the case of the city. Its parts are of different nature, and the dispositions are unequal in excellence. What is he talking about? Well, he's saying, you know, in the body, you have like different limbs and they do different things, right? My hand can grasp things, my foot helps me walk, but who rules it all? Well, depending on your view, it's the heart or the head, you know, the brain, they kind of don't think of it so highly, they don't really understand it. But the heart is the ruling organ. Without it, wouldn't work. And this is called the city soul kind of analogy, city body. And so similarly in politics, there are lots of people who are kind of the feet and the arms, right? They farm and they defend us, but there's also a ruling organ, the heart. That's the ruler. So, and all of that is based, this kind of analogy is based on the idea that humans are of different nature, right? That the ones who are the arms and the limbs are not as smart as the ones who are the heart. Because humans have differing natures, we need society, but society is organized by those natures hierarchical. Those of excellent nature ought to lead the others. We would think of this as a very kind of patriarchal or paternalistic idea, right? Like I'm the heart, I know what's good for you. But you can see here the kind of political impact here. The rubber really hits the road of thinking of human nature as primarily intellectual and varying. It sets up a hierarchical society. The bonus that this idea of like God is the one who gave this nature hovers in the background, but it really props up the politics, right? If you think God is the one who made humans intellectually varying, then God props up hierarchical political structures, right? Because that's the way things are. That's how God made humans. It's really a genius idea if you're an elitist. With this argument, Farabi paves the basic ground for those after him. However, what many have failed to understand is that the philosophers are far from an agreement with each other on the details of politics. That's when things get really interesting. That's when my book gets really interesting. There's no one position. So you have this basic idea, yeah, we're all different. We need to come together. Somebody needs to rule others. But the Islamic philosophers are all asking different questions about this, and they actually put different emphases. So for example, this guy Ibn Bajjah, who's really a very kind of flowery figure, he asked questions of the limits of human politics. So he says, yeah, that's great. Humans are ideally social, but what if you find yourself in adverse circumstances? What if you're like an excellent person who's meant to be the heart, but you like live in a shitty city, right? Like nobody gets me kind of thing, right? How can philosophers who find themselves in a failing city, everybody's debaucherous, nobody wants to listen to the heart, nobody's interested in your virtuous ideas, still achieve happiness? So he's in fact so concerned with this issue, mostly because he himself, apparently nobody liked him. But this is most at the root of all pre-modern, well, probably contemporary thought too, but it's people's problems. He's so concerned with this issue, he writes his most well-known treatise on it. It's called The Rule of the Solitary, literally like, how do you live if nobody likes you? And so he says, man is by nature political in this text. However, while bread and meat are healthy nutriment by nature, and opium and colocin are deadly poison, the body may be in unnatural states where these latter two can be useful and must be used, and natural diet's harmful and must be avoided. Now, what does he mean by that? I have a great job, right? Trying to figure this stuff out. So he's trying to say there are situations where what is generally good for us, sociality, is in fact a poison. Right? You can be surrounded by such idiots that like to live with them is pointless. Like they're not going to help you with your happiness. You're not going to help them. So here Plato's wrong. He's like, this doesn't make sense if you live in a bad situation. If assuming that people influence us to such a degree, the person who's doing well, who has the smart nature, should be solitary. They should consider emigration when they find themselves in less than ideal social circumstances. Ibn Bajjah, in fact, radical for many, recommends emigration in a community of like-minded thinkers over above a basic affirmation of sociality. And this idea that if you're really in a shitty situation, and you're really smart, you need to leave, is one that be extremely influential in medieval Christian and Jewish thought. And Ibn Bajjah is the person that they all read. And he's extremely popular in Jewish philosophy at the time. So while he shares this idea that Farabi introduced, that people have different levels of competency, he's much less optimistic about the ability of those really smart people to actually rule, right? Well, it'd be nice to have a society in which everybody is assigned a role based on their nature. This is not the reality he addresses. Instead, he focuses on the potential leader, but in adverse circumstances, or what he calls the solitary or weed. So he says, for a person who's perfect but lives in an imperfect city, they only have the happiness of the solitary, and the sound rule for them, the sound kind of idea about politics would be the tadbir, the politics of the solitary, where there be one such solitary person or more than one. So Ibn Bajjah, in fact, devotes to those solitary folks their own political structure, and he develops his own idea of like, how do you become like a community of smart philosophers who essentially leave society and live by themselves? He looks at what we would think of as the underbelly of Al-Farabi's lofty ideas about politics, and assures those frustrated by real politics that they too can achieve perfection namely by just basically leaving politics. However, what is even more interesting is that Ibn Bajjah believes that those exceptional solitary figures who have achieved perfection and who have left can be a motor for political change. He thinks of them as weeds and argues that the existence of the weeds is the cause of the occurrence of the perfect city. So while he's pessimistic about the reality of perfect cities, saying, you know, Plato and Al-Farabi, they really just focused on a place where everybody wants to follow the leader, he does think political change is possible. So philosophers can lead change as solitary weeds. It's one of my favorite images, actually, this idea that, you know, if you're just like a weird weed and you hang around long enough, you just overgrow everything, and then things are beautiful by being covered in weeds. Whatever. He also has a book on botany, so I don't know. So that's interesting. Now, one figure I haven't given, well, actually, let's go to our friend Ibn Rushd. So while Ibn Bajjah is really pessimistic, right? He says, listen, Farabi, you have a great political theory here, but nobody likes me. Philosophers might not actually be able to lead. Ibn Rushd is a lot more optimistic. So we return to Ibn Rushd, our last thinker, and he's kind of like, no, Farabi's right. Like societies can function like that. And he's actually the person who's most optimistic or kind of enthusiastic about the idea that if you have a society ordered by hierarchy, you still have some sort of like shared life. So he returns to Farabi's main idea that humans are social because of their differing natures and achieve happiness in society. But he bolsters this claim with some of the lessons that Ibn Bajjah highlights. He writes very clearly in his own commentary on Ibn Bajjah's work, a forsaking of mankind is impossible. This idea that philosophers can leave and like start their own weed society is bad. And it doesn't work. And so he notes when he writes on the Republic, he writes a lot of commentaries, as you can see. A human being is in need of others for both the acquisition of virtues and the necessities of life. Therefore, they are a political being by nature. Return to Farabi. And he agrees it's not just that, you know, we all live together and that's helpful, but he's very explicit about the fact that the just society, the functioning society, is one that's ordered by natures hierarchically. So every citizen is following the activity for which they are best qualified by nature. And thus, when the people are subordinated to what speculative science and those who master it decree. Everybody's got their spot, stay in your spot, we'll have a great society. So Ibn Rushd is also an elitist, but he's learned a thing or two from the way in which people have been complaining about Farabi's ideas. So while he agrees, if you remember from an earlier slide, that different discourses are good for different people, logic for those of exceptional nature, rhetoric or religion for others, he does not think such differences justify the kind of avoidance strategy that Ibn Bajjah ponders. And at the same time, he thinks there's more to politics than the smartest rule, right? So Farabi had this perfect idea. You have the smartest, they're at the top, they're the heart, the rest needs to follow. Ibn Bajjah is kind of like, it doesn't really work like that. People don't like me. And so Ibn Rushd is like, okay, it needs a bit more thought than this. So for functioning just society in which the elites are able to lead the masses, he says we need elites that are capable of speaking across lines of difference. You see, there's some basic political messages, right? Like you don't want to go out there and be like, you're all dumb, I'll take care of you. Right? Like you need to package it differently, he basically says. So he explicitly addresses the question of whether the philosophers or those of exceptional nature need to also follow the kind of general rules, you know? For example, religion. All the philosophers think religion is for the dumb people. They can't get demonstration, right? So they follow the Quran. And Ibn Rushd is like, maybe that's not the best way to run your society. Maybe we need to like talk about it differently. So he explicitly talks about the fact that philosophers too need to be versed in religion. So he says the existence of the learned is only perfected and its full happiness attained by participation with the masses. So you can't just be those philosophers up there and try to rule if you're not actually talking to the people, or you'll end up with this idea Ibn Bajjah had where you all need to leave because nobody likes you. So the religions are, Ibn Rushd says, according to the philosophers, obligatory, since they lead towards wisdom in a way universal to all human beings. Philosophy only leads a certain number of people to the knowledge of intellectual happiness, and therefore have to learn wisdom, whereas religion seeks the instruction of the masses generally. Meaning, you're a philosopher, you want to lead, you need to talk people in their own language. Nobody really gets philosophy. So talk to them about in the ways that religion talks about. Use the Quran, essentially. So he says explicitly, society only works if there's a communication and participation. The philosophers need to be what he calls prophets in order to be successful. Every prophet is a philosopher, but not every philosopher is a prophet. The learned, however, are those of whom it is said they are the heirs of the prophets. If you want to make political change, you speak the language of the masses, so you become essentially a prophet. That's what he's saying. Radical for philosophical thought at the time. One of the reasons that, yes, we're almost done. I have 2 pages. One of the reasons why people think he might have been not as genuine, that he's just kind of saying this to get people on his side. I think he's actually genuine. He thinks this is the way forward. So where does this leave us? We received clearly a lot of ideas about politics, but they differ, right? Farabi sets up the classical theory, the best should lead. Ibn Bajjah agrees with Farabi, humans are naturally social and the excellent should rule, but he's more dubious whether this actually comes about. And things kind of culminate in Ibn Rushd, who returns to the realities of politics. Yes, the elites lead the masses, but they ought to be skilled communicators. I don't have to say this explicitly, but of course, none of these political ideas really appeal today to us. What is significant and why I talk about them is the ways in which they reinterpret Quranic and classical philosophical ideas and use them to each of their individual interests, right? So we see the shared interest in human intellect, but divergent applications. Now, getting away from the weeds, what do I want you to take home from this? Well, I see 4 things. Human nature for the philosophers is a term used to talk about intellectual agility in some way or another. And they make use of it mostly talk about variance, inability, or difference. Much of that talk of human difference serves them in the political context, arguing for natural sociality in some cases, as well as hierarchical political organization. But as we saw, this is only one of the several areas of application. While human nature is prominently used in political discourse, it also appears in virtue and music theory, mysticism, law, and ideas about language. Given all of that, human nature is a clearly contextual concept and as such read slightly differently across thinkers or even within a single corpus. We've seen both the shared interests of the philosophers in discourses of natural human intellectual difference and their different contextual concerns, as well as conclusions. While in general, human nature for them is all about difference, the thinkers I consulted are not all answering the same questions or pursuing the same interests or coming to the same conclusions. Some are interested in mystical questions, some are in legal questions, some talk about reproduction, for some gender comes up, for some education, for some not. Some are assuming failing situations, others focus on human difference, and so forth. While this overall insight of a complex and contextual interpretation of human nature should not actually surprise us, given the opening slide I showed you with my students, human nature today is still complex and contextual,